Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fully Charged Show podcast, where today we're doing something a little different. And I'm excited, a little nervous and very intrigued to get your reaction. Now, a while back, we featured the legendary Ian Callum, former Aston Martin and Jaguar designer, alongside Alec Jones, head of design at Callum. And this is the extended interview from that episode. Now, given their extreme car design talent, obviously, I deemed it sensible to get their expert opinions on some car designs that I whipped up using an AI tool called Vizcom. Safe to say, the feedback wasn't glowing, far from it in fact, but their critiques opened up a far more existential conversation about creativity, AI tools, and whether we'll harness them or be led by them. Ian and Alec are incredibly eloquent when it comes to the world of car design, and for me, this conversation became a fascinating reflection on the future of design versus function and the irreplaceable magic of human skill. AI, of course, is the topic du jour. It dominated 2024, and for good reason. Beyond its impact on design, its energy-intensive nature is going to shake up systems like microgrids, renewable energy co-location, and even district heat networks. And we'll dig into these game-changing topics in more detail in 2025. But for now, sit back and enjoy this delightful conversation with Ian and Alec. If you're listening rather than watching, we'll be discussing some images in the first 5 minutes, and you can find the link to see them on YouTube in the description. And if you're already here on YouTube, I can only apologise in advance for the abominations I dared to call car designs. What was I thinking? Let's dive in.
This episode of the Fully Charged podcast is brought to you by OVO's Charge Anywhere. Charge Anywhere helps you power your car wherever you are, plan your route and pay. You'll have access to over 34,000 chargers across the UK's largest charging networks and more than 400,000 chargers across Europe. Setup is easy. Just download the OVO Charge app, create your account, add payment details, hit the road and start charging. There's no need to be an OVO customer either. Simply pay as you go or benefit from up to 15% off your charging with monthly boost packages. OVO's Charge Anywhere. Power your next journey with peace of mind.
Alec and Ian, thank you so much for... I'm actually very nervous. I'm very worried about what you're going to say because I need to give you a couple of caveats before we get into this. First of all, I need to tell you my inspiration. So I decided to bring together some of my favourite cars. So that's the new Rivian R3, the Porsche 964 RSR, the Citroën AX GTI, the Renault R5, and the Ioniq 5. So, quite a spread of stuff there. But then I wanted to kind of mash those things together, make it a little bit more cyberpunky and a bit more sort of...
Cyberpunky. Love that.
And then a bit more...
Write that down.
Swoopy and angular at the same time. And this is what I've got. But critically, I wanted to do this without having any real kind of Photoshop skill. So my only Photoshop that I've really done is mashing two things together with some real botched cropping and then spending about 5 minutes in Vizcom trying to get something. So here we go. Got a couple of things to show you, but I think I'm going to start with my favourite one. Now this is, well, I'll see if you can recognise it, but what do you think of this? That's not a good laugh.
It's hilarious. It's a cartoon car.
Oh, so I have a slightly more...
It's a cartoon car. Right,
Oh,
okay.
okay.
What's your initial impression when you look at that?
It's completely out of scale, isn't it? The whole thing.
Proportions are all a bit off.
How so? What's the sort of really key giveaway?
Well, I mean, just looking at it, the side doesn't feel like it lines up with the front. There's a lot of fresh air underneath it. I mean, there's volumes that are slightly odd, and his rear arch is all a bit strange. I mean, it's slightly better there, in fact. But I don't know what you think, Ian.
The form language is completely different.
Yeah.
You've got a form language, you've got a statement there which kind of in itself works. Then you've got the Porsche form language at the back, which in itself works. We all know very well.
Mm-hmm.
But the two together do not work and never will work.
See, this is where it's like, but I love the front of the Rivian and I love the rear of the...
But they're two very different things.
So when you say the form language...
It's like putting jelly on a steak, isn't it?
But then that's where I think this is really interesting, because that is a totally subjective thing through your sort of, expertise. So why, is there a way that you can express that in words, why the two form languages don't go together?
Yeah, because when I'm thinking about a car design, I think about a totality, and that's actually one of the strengths of what I do. I can edit well when we're going through a design process and get a totality where the whole object looks as one. That's very important to me, because when you're about 200 yards away, 200 meters away, you'll be able to look at that object and see it as one, regardless of the details. That to me is called the draftsmanship of it. That is drawing the composition in the picture. And if you don't do that correctly, it will never be right. Like these two cars, they'll never be right.
So I'm going to show you another one before I come back to that, because I think it's that totality and that idea of physical space and volume that I really want to kind of dig into a little bit more. But before then, I've got another horror to show you.
Good.
Well, I don't think it's a horror, so it'll be interesting to see what you think. Now, this is, the starting point was an Ioniq 5, and again, my favourite, the Porsche 964 RSR. Now, I want you to ignore some of the things that are clunky and a real consequence of my poor initial Photoshop, and more think of this as a kind of very first concept. That silence isn't good either.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose if you blend them together, it starts to make up a car. And I've seen a bit of this in real cars, actually. And it does, it makes me cringe slightly to think that people have copied elements and tried to bring them together. But again, the form language is not correct. You've got the form language of the Porsche, which is very positive and very deliberate and very well known, goes back years. And then you've got this fresh, new form language, which is completely alien to it. And could you ever bring them two together? I don't know. I mean, I never say no completely, because creativity is about accepting new things. But they have to work.
They do have to work. Yeah, it needs to be a homogeneous design. I mean, just again looking at this from experience, I know that the second you extrapolate that into, you start looking at it, and the side view is going to look a little bit like a shoe, and I don't mean that as a slight on anything you've done here. You've got some really odd. Ian always says, when you're designing cars, it's all about speed and where the lines are going. And if you imagine where these lines are heading, it's not anywhere you want them to go. So, it's an interesting shape.
It's not working.
No.
I'm really enjoying the sort of gentle brutality of your feedback here. Okay, one more before we get into a little bit more discussion.
The interesting thing about here is you might have had a little bit more success because your A post here isn't aligning up with that A post. So you've got this really weirdly exaggerated length to it, which is probably, all I can see here is if you move this further forward a bit, you'd ended up with proportionally something that made a bit more sense, I think.
And also the scale this way as well, but
It's not a no. So, okay, this one.
It's not a no, but it's a very unlikely.
I think this one may give you the biggest nightmares. I absolutely adore the original Citroën DS. I also have recently seen the Renault R5, which is also quite a nostalgic design, particularly at the rear. So those were my two sources of inspiration. And again, ignoring some of the funny things. Both French. Maybe that's where the similarities stop. But
Oh well.
oh dear.
It's funny because obviously the DS has got quite a lot of length to it visually, and it's got a lot of speed to it, and it's a beautiful car. And then the Renault R5 is almost the opposite side of the spectrum, where it's a little bit more compact, it's a little bit more fun.
Yeah. It's like a contradiction in
Yeah.
statement, really. As you say, the 5 is a very clunky, a very positive shape, but it's about squatness. It has a cuteness about it. And the DS is a little bit aerodynamic feel.
So
The two very contradictory sort of form languages and statements and intentions. The guy that went out to design the DS had this intention of creating something that floats through the air beautifully. And it is beautiful as a result. It's very pure.
Yeah.
The DS is really about a functional car that seats 4 or 5 people in a very functional manner, very matter of fact. And it has a beauty for that, but they're two very different beauties.
It's so interesting hearing some of your thoughts and feedback on my designs, in inverted commas. And you're sort of looking at how this doesn't make sense as an entire thing. The physicality of it hasn't really been considered. And from my perspective, I think what I've done is kind of extract my favourite things from various different cars, my favourite bits of design language, and tried to make them work together. And as a consequence, I haven't got anything original there. There's nothing individual at all. This is totally stealing ideas that already exist. And so I wonder, to get that kind of true individuality and personality in design, does that have to come from a human being? Can it ever come from AI?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, there are 2 ways to create something. You do take stuff that exists and you bring it together, and it might be experiences, it might be physical entities, and that's most of the time how most designers work. They're being influenced by other areas, and you bring it together and create something new. However, I think there's something much deeper than that. If you want to be really original, you have to create something from within, an atmosphere and a feeling. You know, I'll never forget, I saw a movie when I was very young called The Glenn Miller Story. He was a composer, had an orchestra. He was looking for a sound. And I remember in this, he was saying, I'm looking for something, it's in my head, I can't get it out. I know it's there, but I can't quite find it. And eventually he came out with it. The Glenn Miller sound is a very famous sound. And that's something he created personally through his own emotions and his own understanding of music. And I found at that point, I found that fascinating. That's where true creativity comes from, is from within. And I've used that ever since, an example to myself, to remind myself that you have to really dig deep to find something original.
So I find that really interesting, because you hear that a lot with any kind of creative discipline. You hear it from authors who are like, I had this book that was inside and it just needed to come out onto the page. And I wonder whether AI in that sense can operate almost as a kind of a mining tool. I've used AI in this instance to mine my own imagination and to Google translate my imagination onto a page such that we can have this conversation with some kind of fluency, rather than me saying, oh, well, you know, I kind of like the Rivian R3 lights, I love the back of the Porsche 964 RSR. It has given us that sort of slightly more even ground in which to have this discussion. So I wonder, Alec, I know that you've honed your craft in when there's been different tools available. So is there a way that you are using AI to kind of to lasso your imagination and bring it to life?
Yeah, I mean, I've always known tools like Photoshop, 3D modeling, all that good stuff. And AI to me feels like, and then I know I wasn't around for the dawn of Photoshop, but and that's no slight on me at all. But
Magic markers for me.
yeah, it feels like it's almost that level of resurgence. You know, it's a new tool, and I wouldn't say it's scary, but it's taking something that, you know, I know takes time, takes patience, takes, you know, skill, and allowing people to create renderings. And in this instance, you've used Vizcom, which is very much predetermined on its inputs. You get decent outputs if you put in really, really good inputs. And
what are you saying about my inputs?
I'm not saying I'm not. I think it's all some really interesting stuff. But you know, the best way to use a tool like Vizcom is if you have a sketch, for example, and then it very quickly renders it up, and then you can very quickly churn out dozens and dozens and dozens of iterations of a very similar thing. And then, you know, I can see all these things you've done here, and you know, with a bit more time and a bit more patience, we could put these through Photoshop and create something that's a little bit more homogeneous and a little bit more in keeping with the sort of the design philosophy that we know so well here at Callum. But no, I certainly see it as another tool in the arsenal of designers, and you know, I can see there's elements of design work that become easier using things like AI.
Do you have a different perspective?
Slightly. I don't disagree with any of that. I think there's a validity there, and and at the moment it's a rendering tool more than anything else. It's not a three-dimensional thing. However, you must never lose control of what you're doing. I remember when the days of Alias appeared, and we were 3D modeling.
And Alias is a 3D modeling tool.
3D modeling software. So designers started to model in 3D, and what I found was they were beholden to the capability of the alias, structure, and they were creating objects which they would not have created by themselves because the tool was telling them what to do. You must never ever let that happen. Now alias is much more sophisticated, and people who can drive it are much more adept at using it, and therefore what they want out of it, or what the designer wants out of it, is much more under control. But through that period of instruction and discovery, I found that the alias was driving the style.
Which was interesting, because around that time, that's when people were like, oh, we don't need clay modelling of full-size cars. And then obviously we've brought clay models back for this reason.
I don't think they ever went away. I think, it's probably similar conversations people are having about AI now were being had about clay models. Clay models are still used in every design studio that I'm aware of. And there are probably more money-conscious ways of doing full-size models, and that smaller businesses are using. But there's no substitute for representation of a design in full-size 3D.
And that's one of the things I want to ask you about, that sense of volume and physicality. And you hit that's kind of language that you hear a lot from designers, that you understand volume and proportions in a way that maybe I certainly don't. But if products live in the real world, in the physical world, do you think it's a vital skill for designers to be able to have that appreciation in order to create anything of substantial value? Or again, can AI eventually kind of take that away?
Yes, because that three-dimensional object that you're creating manifests itself as something which is a joy to look at. And that's an understanding of the skill that designers and modelers have. And I think it'll be a long time before AI can actually look at that and make a decision whether a form is a beautiful form. And it might be millimeters, or it's not a beautiful form. Now, the big question is, does it have a validity? Does it have a value? Well, if you're going to design something, let's design to the best of our ability. That's always been my philosophy. Now, if you make it slightly less, does it matter to the outside world? Does it matter to its sales? Possibly not. But as a human being, you have to take the attitude that you're going to do the best job possible. And that includes the understanding of form in a very human way, a very emotional way. I really believe in that. And I think it'll be a long time before you can show AI a clay model and say to it, well, why is that? They can work it out by highlights, yes, but why is that form right or wrong?
One of the things that we heard a lot about the Nyobolt car that we've featured on the channel before is that you spent a lot of time thinking about the shape, the volumes, the lines, how it sort of has you have a beautiful expression. It's like the shape of movement, or I'm totally ruining that, aren't I?
Shape of movement.
You'll come up with
sense
something
of
even
speed.
better.
Sense of speed, that was it.
Sense of speed, yeah.
Sense of speed, and it certainly does. And there is something innate that you say, this person understands how to design a car. Was that sense of physicality and space and volume, is that something that has been a natural skill of yours, or is that something that's had to be learnt and honed over the years?
It's definitely something that over the years, designing things and working with various different designers, you pick up. I mean, I've learned so much working with Ian, with Julian, and even on the Nyobolt car, where there was a point where we were all very happy with it, and Ian walked in within 30 seconds, was like, this and this are completely different. And obviously, there's loads of experience there. So I'm still learning, and it's still something that we're working towards. But the Nyobolt was particularly good because we knew going into it that there was this beautiful core line that we wanted to maintain, and that rolled into the rear arch. So that was kind of the goal going into it, and we knew that's something that was going to drive a lot of the surfacing and the volumes of that car.
But it's not easy.
No.
It takes time.
Yeah.
It takes time. It takes a lot of scrutiny. And I think the other thing is this notion of self-scrutiny is very, very important. I'm not sure AI would actually do that. You've got to look at your work and analyse it as if someone else has done it.
Which is hard in any discipline,
Yeah.
but is so vital that you actually get something that's of value. I've got a few more questions just to manage expectations. I want to ask you about sketching. And one of the things that you've mentioned before is that actually when you take Vizcom, you could do what I've done, which is terrible Photoshop, or you could take an original sketch and then work with Vizcom to kind of give you a set of different iterations. But how valuable is that skill of sketching? Is it still vital for designers today?
I think so, yes. Because you're putting on paper, hopefully, what you're thinking, not what you're copying. As I said before, you can pull all these ideas from all sorts of different sources and put it onto a piece of paper and try and make it work. But I think if you're designing from within and you have a feeling and an atmosphere you're looking for, you need to be able to sketch, because that's your point of communication. That's your language. But you need to be able to speak it, that language, without thinking about it. You're thinking about what you want, and your hand and pencil create something that you want to see, and that's what you hand on to somebody else. So it's very important to me.
But not just that, you're also trying to capture. There's a character and a quality to sketches. There's a speed, and there's a whole character to a sketch that often gets lost if you go straight into 3D or if you go through AI, because there's this, as Ian was saying, the speed of
Form.
Yeah. And that you only really hone down on once you do that really sort of tactile pen to paper interaction.
There's also something else interesting about sketching. Once you learn to draw competently, you have certain ways of drawing which are fairly spontaneous. It's not to say that should override what you're thinking. Sometimes it does, but that spontaneity that you create with a brush or a pencil, that sense of movement, is a wonderful thing. It's a very human thing to do, where the emphasis is and where the flow away is, and then the job of designers is to contain that and keep it to the very end through all the processes. That's difficult.
So it sounds like what you're describing is that when you are sketching, there is sort of a part of your brain that you are accessing somehow, and it is being translated onto the page in a way that's so difficult to put words to. And what that also sounds like, and we hear this term a lot when it comes to not only automotive design, but anything that's been designed by people rather than AI, is soul. So I guess the question is, what is soul when it comes to design? And what is it about that makes something intrinsically more valuable or lovable or whatever it might be if it has that soul?
It's a sense of feeling, and hopefully a sense of joy. It's something that you put down first of all into paper, then it manifests as a car, and it gives people joy. And I think that's the sort of the soul that you give an object. Is that sense of people wanting to enjoy it and looking at it.
And do you think we will always need people to embed that soul and joy into something?
I hope so.
100%. And
I hope so.
Yeah.
Because AI can only really emulate. Yes, it creates sort of emulation, but it's emulating it's pulling from all over the place, and it's an infinite amount of information it has now. However, it's still emulating. I mean, you have to ask yourself: could AI have created the work of Shakespeare? And could it have done it if Shakespeare had never existed? I doubt it very much.
So there is a slightly existential question though when we talk about soul, because let's talk about mobility. And if we purely thought of mobility as getting from A to B in the most efficient way possible, in that instance we're probably valuing utility, practicality above and beyond beauty and art. And in that world, do we need soul in our physical objects? Do we need soul in things that purely serve as practical objects?
You mean like an army truck?
Yeah, or like
if you look at an army truck, it's an interesting thing to look at. It's designed entirely from a functional engineering point of view. There is no aesthetic in it whatsoever. I mean, I do see them and I look at them with fascination, and that in itself creates an aesthetic, which becomes appealing to some people. I think what you're talking about are a set of givens, a set of objectives which you have to adhere to, and they're numeric. You have to measure it, it's very geometric, you have to measure it, but when you bring all this together, there's no reason why you cannot and should not apply a sense of aesthetic understanding to that, so that it's got an element of pleasantness about it that would not be there had it been done just purely by numbers. There is a difference. There is a difference, and even when you look at the most practical objects of function, if a human being has designed it, which inevitably they have so far, then it's got an element of beauty about it if it's done properly. Or it's got an element of ugliness about it because they haven't done it properly, you know?
Alec, is that how you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I could say any better than Ian has. I mean, you're talking to the wrong audience here. I mean, we love cars. We love, you know, we see cars as beautiful forms, and that's the reason why we do the job that we do. So I certainly hope that we're not ever going to go down the route where we're sort of 3D printing, mass-produced, generic objects. But yeah, I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there.
That glass doesn't have to have all these facets on it, does it?
No, still
But it does, and it's lovely for it. That's human input.
And so, what would your advice be then to, say, a 17-year-old who wants to be an automotive designer, or a designer in general? Should they be hopeful about the future that maybe exists for them within this field?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, one of my I was talking to someone about this the other day. One of my worries is for the younger designers. You know, the ones who are in university. I mean, university isn't so far away from me that I remember the late nights and the last minute deadlines. And I worry that AI might become almost a get out of jail free card. And as we were discussing at the start, you know, a lot of this we could take, and using a lot of the skills that I've learned over the years, we could turn into what is perceived as a good design and capturing all that lovely form language. But if going into university and if going into a car design job, your default is using AI immediately without picking up the ability to sketch or the ability to, whether it's Photoshop, whether it's 3D, any of those things, but ability to take the AI output and put in your own input and really capture that human element, then I'd worry along that route. But no, I do think I'm still sort of the belief that this will become a really powerful tool going forward for all designers, so long as there is a tangible way to recapture the human input back into whatever the output is.
Which is interesting, because some of the things that you've said is that it is that kind of co-pilot, but at making sure that you're still ultimately in control and not being led by
That's key.
this thing. Yeah.
Keeping in control of your thoughts and how you want to apply them is key. And never let the tool take over.
I think that's a good point to end on. Anything that you think I should have asked you or you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think the one thing that does concern me is imagery is very powerful, as we know, as we see it in social media all the time. It's very powerful. A lot of it's fake. And you know, with all respect to your images, these cars don't exist. They are fake. But it takes the unknowledgeable, dare I say it, the bosses of a business to say, well, that's good enough for me, so why do we need designers? And they do, because someone will come along and design a better one because they've thought about it, and it doesn't just come from an image. And I think there's a danger these images are taken too literally by people who are in control of a business or car industry and say that's good enough. That's fine, because it's not. It's not good enough. I'm not saying this to protect our position in the world. I'm saying this because I believe we can do better through thought and through understanding and through emotions.
Well, certainly one of the things that has come out of these discussions generally, not just with yourselves, but the other people we've interviewed for this, is that the fear that comes from AI is that it makes things totally reductive. It reduces things to like this to say, that is good enough, we'll make that. When the reality is actually they are an opportunity to expand horizons, to craft or mine new bits of your imagination that were previously sort of slightly out of reach, and to bring them and to make that much more valuable. But that is the risk that we are at this particular juncture. It's let's not make it reductive. Let's use it as a superpower to make us more creative. Yeah.
It's a tool. That's it.
Yeah. Alec, anything you feel you want to say before we kind of wrap up?
He's worried I'm going to fire him.
This is actually a job interview.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, a lot of AI is you can bomb it down to efficiency. AI is particularly good at things like generative design. there are cars on the road. I think it's the Singer 21C that has these beautifully generatively designed components, and that's AI optimizing something for weight and stiffness, etc., etc. And I think it's Toyota, in fact, who have developed an AI model whereby you can input a designer sketch and you can optimize the sketch with aerodynamic efficiency and package. And so you sort of bypassed some initial feasibility elements. I mean, it's all early days from the article I read, but efficiency is sort of where I see AI really having its moment in the sun. But it's certainly not, I don't think it's replacing the process. It's just, as you say, another tool in the designer's toolkit.
But it's such an elegant way to put it, because, say for example you take Google Maps, you want the quickest route from A to B, you'll get the quickest route from A to B.
Yeah.
But journeys you might want a bit of green space or to stop for coffee, and that nuance isn't necessarily going to be captured by something purely optimised for efficiency. So there you have it. For now, I'm cautiously optimistic that the wonderfully intangible spark of human imagination and skill remains irreplaceable. Of course, AI might be great at wrangling that imagination into something tangible, but replacing it? Not a chance. At least, not yet. Let us know what you think in the comments. Please do send this to a friend, or like, comment or subscribe, or all of the above. And if you have been, thank you for listening and watching.